Our next and final discussion of the morning is going to explore public policy and social impact efforts currently underway to expand the labor market to traditionally untapped talent pools. This has been a big, I think, problem over the years, and there's a lot more effort in this space. So it's my pleasure to welcome our moderator for this panel, President of the Urban Institute, Ms. Sarah Rosen Wartell.
Well, thank you guys for still being with us and for caring so much about this. We've got a great group of folks, and I hope we'll keep it lively for you all. So I'm going to introduce and bring in, first of all, Byron Auguste, who you have the bios. He's CEO and co-founder of Opportunity at Work, a social enterprise that works on really helping to work with employers to transform hiring practices, expand learning pathways, and pioneer talent finance. Denis McDonough, who is a senior principal at the Markle Foundation, where he chairs the Rework America Task Force and advises on the Skillful Network. Thank you, Denis. Brent Orrell, who's a resident fellow of domestic policy at the American Enterprise Institute, who previously had a tenure at DOL and HHS and special interest in workforce training for returning citizens. And finally, Elyse Rosenblum, who's principal at Grads for Life, which helps employers nationwide fulfill their talent needs and build talent pipelines for opportunity youth. So really, great group of folks. And each of you has been involved in important ways with really innovative and different models for solving the problems that we've been hearing about here. You know, there are these powerful forces of change that we've been hearing about all throughout today that are really helping to change the way the workforce, employers work, the way the demands on employees. Those forces of change have put us at some risk. And it's a risk that the inequalities that we see across our society could actually become hardened. And in fact, the gap between those who have a chance to participate in growth and those that don't could become further widened. But each of you in your own ways have talked about ways in which we can harness some of those forces and use those forces to technology in particular, but also the power of our demographic change and the change to our population. Some of that can actually become an engine of economic growth and perhaps a tool for us to close some of the gaps that we see in society. So I'm going to ask each of you if you would talk just for a minute about the models that you're most excited about, the programs that you work with or things that you've seen and studied, and what is unique and different about those models, and how does it help to do that gap closing? I'll just start down here and ask each of you. Byron, why don't you start us off?
Yeah. So I was part of the Obama administration and worked with Vice President Biden and the Secretary of Education, Commerce, Labor, and looked across the whole field. We call it job-driven training in the organizations. And there, and in Opportunity at Work, I've seen actually a lot of programs, and we've heard some of them today, that actually work quite well. The most striking thing is the extent to which good programs that accomplish good things don't actually spread, right? They don't spread. And so the question Opportunity at Work is really focused on is how we know employers have this need. We know that there are lots of things that can work, and we believe, and we have lots of evidence, that there's a tremendous amount of talent, particularly in the 100 million or more Americans that don't have bachelor's degrees, but have all sorts of skills that are not recognized in the market. So our focus is to take, and we think about them as people who are skilled through alternative routes, so STARS, and how to change the labor market equation for them. So we like to work with programs, community colleges and others that can actually deliver on a skill set, as we heard about from Lone Star, that employers need, but then to provide something of the infrastructure to connect those programs to employers, to help employers discover them more rapidly, and also when there's gaps that are not being filled, for that information to be clear and the capital to be available to grow the program. So that's the heart of what we're doing. We're not training people. There's a lot of great stuff going on. We're trying to connect those dots so that you can invest behind people for job placement.
Denis, Skillful?
Sarah, Byron, thanks very much. So Skillful just recognizes that, as Byron suggested, right now there's only 30% of our workforce that has a four-year college degree, which means there's 70% of our workforce that does not. But still, as we hire, the labor market still biases and makes itself more opaque by focusing on pedigree. so often we had, for example, an example in Colorado where 73% of job openings for a job called construction manager required a bachelor's degree to get the job. But when you looked at the existing workforce of construction managers, something like 25% of them had a bachelor's degree. So that's the distance between the skill or the pedigree that people have and the pedigree that's asked is a fundamental public policy problem. And so at Skillful and at Markle, we say that we ought to get back to making the labor market more transparent. Let workers trade on the thing that empowers them most, namely their skill. Make sure that employers are advertising openings based on what they most need, namely skill. And make sure then that educators are providing that which the market itself is valuing, skill rather than pedigree. And we've seen this in uptake in Colorado and now Indiana quite aggressively. And as Byron suggests, there's pockets of excellence all along, and we'll hear some of that now. The question now is, how do we get that to scale? So our focus is between now and the next inauguration of a president, be that a re-elected President Trump or a new president. What are the policies that merit federal attention? And I'll talk more about that later.
All right. I just should say, I noticed in the press release I got in my inbox the other day, you're up to 26 states that are part of the network, so working with governors in each of them. So you really have an audience that's very helpful at possibly scaling some of these programs.
Absolutely right. Absolutely
So Brent, you've been doing this for a while now in a couple of different hats. Talk about what you think works.
Well, I think it's important at the outset of the conversation around this to really be clear about which labor market story we're living in, because it's changing so rapidly. You know, we're no longer even in a conversation about the transition from an industrial to an information economy. We're in a new story. We've thought about our labor market as being sort of hollowed out, where you have high-end jobs and you've got low-end jobs and a shrinking middle. And the impact of artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning, and so on is really compressing the entire market. And it's something that we're just now entering into. So we've got, at every point on the spectrum, tremendous pressures building, articles about, farm labor. We now have machines or developing machines that can pick apples and can pick strawberries. That was the kind of stuff that only people could do at the very low end of the skill level. Tax preparation. I mean, I don't know about you, but who goes to a tax preparer anymore unless you've really got a complex return? Paralegals are being replaced by algorithms in many cases. Medical diagnosis. Some doctors are not all that great actually at medical diagnostics. So, and then in the tech sector itself, we now have algorithms that write their own programs. So even those skills that we've held up to the public as being the good jobs in programming are being taken by machines. So that is going to put a lot of pressure, not just on people that we've traditionally thought of as having challenges in the labor market, but this extreme dynamism is creating uncertainty across the entire labor market and rolling forward. And I won't go into it right now, and you've heard a lot of it already from the other panels, this need that we have to build a more flexible workforce. The only thing you can do when you're faced with that much uncertainty is to develop the kinds of skills that will allow you to shift quickly as technology changes.
You've just reinforced the concerns that the worker who approached Chuck at the beginning was talking about. So Elyse, talk a little bit about Grads for Life and how they're approaching this.
Yeah, so at Grads of Life, we focus on a subsection of the population that lacks a four-year degree, which are opportunity youth, young people between the ages of 16 and 24 who may or may not have finished college but haven't obtained a college credential and are not attached to the labor market. And we really work intensively with the private sector to figure out how to help them bring opportunity youth into their talent pipeline. And we do this really with a look at how do we leverage the power of the private sector to close the opportunity divide in the country. It's interesting, you know, when we think about the skills that opportunity youth need in order to make successful transitions into work, we haven't actually talked a lot, I haven't heard a lot of talk today about the sort of core workforce needs of communication, professionalism, work ethic. And those are skills that really cut across for all employers. We heard some great programs, you know, MGM and Comcast, and we work with a lot of employers that are doing excellent work. But if you take it up a level and say, what are things that are going to work across the economy? I think you have to look at the skills that are needed to ensure opportunity youth are ready to make those transitions, and then look at what are the practices employers need to change to be ready to bring in and retain and advance young adults so that they can stay and grow. So we focus a lot on kind of where are the breakdowns in the market, things like making sure young adults are prepared, things like inclusive screening, you know, giving employers tools to screen young adults in rather than to screen them out, and then tools to help support retention and advancement. So, you know, huge fans of tuition advancement programs, but also frontline manager training, because we know for the young adults we focus on, they have a honeymoon phase and then they can plateau, and then a good manager either helps them stay and grow or they quit their manager, you know, just like all of us quit a bad boss. So those are a couple of the places that we think about as key moments for intervention to help close the divide and make sure employers have the workforce they need to grow.
In the world that Brent just talked about, we used to call them soft skills, but I've actually recently heard them called power skills, which I actually think is a better term because it describes the way it powers your ability to work through this economy. So I've been working on these issues for well over 20 years, and the word that I often use to describe conversations like this is we keep talking about models that are bespoke, right? We have so many great examples of things that work in one context for one employee. So Denis, you started to talk a little bit about scale, and I'm going to ask each of you to talk a little bit about scale. And how do we get to the kind of volume in these programs that will allow us to meet the gap in the economy that Brent was talking about? And talk about two actors, if you would. Employers, we've heard from a number of the largest employers, but how do employers aggregate themselves? Because a lot of the jobs in the economy are not people who hire 90 or 120,000 workers. And talk about the role of government, not just at the federal level, but at state and local level as well. And how do we think about their role in getting us to scale the practices that are best?
Thanks, Sarah. I want to just say one thing before I start, which is I see Senator Reed and Landry Reed here in the front. I just want to publicly say what a great gift Nevada gave to the country and Harry Reid. So I'll say three things about this. Rick Levin, noted economist, former president of Yale, who then left to go to Coursera, upstart education company, talks about contagion. And we believe that employers can be as moved by contagion on the use of skills-based practices that I talked about before as anybody. In fact, that's why we started something called the Rework America Business Network. It's basically a network of 11 of the country's biggest employers, all of whom are facing different challenges of the type that each of my colleagues have identified. And the idea is that they'll work together, share best practices, talk about how to get over big humps in the hopes that they, moving together, can bring their industry and their other actors along on the kind of scale that we're talking about. So one is we're aggregating experience of employers to see what they can do together and to get over recognized hurdles. Second, state government. We're focused, as you said, through our Skillful State Network, which now has 26 governors of both parties, at a policymaker, Republican and Democrat, who live above the store. And at the state level, we find that governors need to deliver on these issues in a way that the federal government doesn't feel. So we focus very intently on governors, both because of the scale of the problem and the demands of their voters on those governors. So that's the second thing, is we think both because of the way our labor markets work, but also because governors are on the hook, we should focus on them. Third, and last, on federal level policymakers, I just think there's been so long since there's been real policymaking at the federal level on this, outside of the stovepipes of the federal system, that we're due. And for some of the reasons that we've heard already on the stage, as well as throughout the day, I think demand will be high from voters. So that's why we're focused on early in the next administration, be that this administration reelected or a new one. But let me give you one example. The Higher Education Reauthorization Act authorizes about $130 billion a year. The WIOA, the Workforce Opportunity Investment Act, authorizes about $10 billion a year. Even though the challenge we face as a country right now is not university-based education as much as it is those people outside the university-based system. So federal policymakers need to act, but they also need to right-size our investments into the challenges that we face as a country.
So Byron, I'm going to come back to you one second, but let me do a quick follow-up to
Please.
Brent. So we're at a moment when the economy is particularly robust. So as you talk a little bit about these two questions I put to all of you, private sector involvement, how do we think about making sure that there's a contagion that will persist through different cycles in the economy? And then welcome your broader thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's this is a lot better place to be than the other end that we were in 2007, 8, 9, where we had you know, a lot of slack in the labor market, and it was pretty miserable. And it's great to be in this place where there's a lot of pull, trying to bring people into the labor market who are currently outside. People who are outside the labor market right now are outside the labor market for some pretty good reasons. They have substantial barriers to employment that are keeping them out of this very robust economy. And I think we have to ask a bunch of questions about that. Speaking of contagion, that we need to ask questions about what sorts of things could help to reduce those barriers, and there are some things that can help, not as many as we need. We also need to be thinking about what we can do to turn off the spigot of people that find themselves in that situation. And for me, that always goes back to family formation. What are we doing in infancy and early childhood that can address what we all know is really the key problem, the foundational problem of these soft, non-cognitive power skills, whatever you want to call them. Everybody calls them something different. But until we address that, it is extremely difficult to take people who lack those kind of foundational skills and try to layer any kind of job training or education on top of that. That's really tough. And so we need to do that. We need to keep trying on that front, but we also need to really focus on what we can do to support families in the primary task of preparing children for education.
So Byron, we have people who are, even those who are attached to the labor force, are attached in places where their ability to generate an income that's family sustaining is pretty limited. So if you would go back to this question of scale and the role of employers in the public sector.
Yeah, I mean, to the question of scale, just three fundamental premises that if you don't agree with this, if you don't believe this, you probably aren't going to agree with my answer, so I just want to expose them. Number one, there is a tremendous amount of work to do. Work is solving problems, and if you look around, you'll find we're not actually running out of problems, right? Like work is sort of, it's healing people, it's building things, it's fixing things. There's so much work to do, And there's a whole other set of issues about what's happening in both public policy and corporate governance that we're not investing in enough of that work. So that's number two. Number two is there is a tremendous amount of talent in all sorts of packages that we're not seeing. So many of these panel discussions or other scenarios, the implicit assumption is that people without bachelor's degrees, that they're problems to solve. But actually, people are problem solvers. People have problems, but people aren't problems. They're problem solvers, and you have people busting their butts every day, and the question is, how do we support them? How do we put the wind in their back, not how to do it? So in other words, there's a lot of talent that's actually being missed. And finally, there's an issue of dynamism in the entire economy, and you don't have to believe that the people out of the labor market can be trained to code, right? What you need to believe is some people in the labor market who are actually doing IT, they're a receptionist doing IT for their business, they could get a job in IT, and someone else could get their job who's working at Starbucks, and someone else who's out might be able to get that job. So the dynamism is important. So but then if you think about it that way, then the way we scale, first of all, I agree with Denis, and I'm part of this rework effort, practices and employer practices matter a lot. It is so much of what's holding this back isn't actually legislation. I mean, Brent, I see you worked on issues of sort of bringing people in who've had a prison record. That's a classic example. That's almost a third of the American workforce. But there are all these barriers to hiring. But the biggest one of all is what Denis alluded to, that if you don't have a bachelor's degree, you are increasingly screened out of a ton of jobs. My dad went to college for a year. He dropped out. This was in 1970. He saw an ad to learn COBOL, right? At the time, IBM. He learned it. He got a job shadow at Detroit Edison in the MIS department. That was our family's path into the middle class. My father could not, in this labor market, have that same opportunity. Why is it? We've gone backwards. So these practices matter. Then policies matter. It's hard to write a law to fix this, right? I mean, without all sorts of unintended consequences. But I do think, in terms of financing, if you think about the way we do higher education, I agree with Denis in sort of the mismatch. But also, if you think about it, a student loan puts the individual who knows the least about the labor market outcome on the hook to pay it back, and it makes the school whole from the beginning. I think we should be financing more, not just college, but like absolutely non-college alternatives, but much more of the funding should go to adult learners for their living expenses, which is really the hard thing to do. That should be a grant. And more of the school should be more on the hook for part of the answer, to have a better aligned incentive to do it. That's an example of a policy change that can matter. And then the last piece that I think is really important, think about platforms. So we all know, we don't tend to talk about it in workforce, but in other parts of the world, there's search engines, right? There's also job search, there's applicant tracking systems. So much of what is the barriers are actually hardwired into systems and workflows. And so a lot of what we do at Opportunity at Work is going to the heart of that. So if you have an applicant tracking system that's baked in an exclusionary process, how do you work with those platforms to make an inclusive answer just as easy and just as streamlined for a business as an exclusionary one? And I think there's a lot of potential in that direction too.
Elyse?
So I think, when we think about employers and what are the scalable solutions, from that perspective, I mean, I would just check on the concept of practices. And I think, I've worked in this space for a long time, and in the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen growing focus on the demand side solutions. And there's frankly a lot of clutter right now. And it's confusing for employers about what to do if you want to do something, especially I think for small and medium employers who don't have big HR offices to figure this out. So one of the things that we've been doing in collaboration with a bunch of other players in the field is to come up with a shared set of what does it mean to be a good opportunity employer? What are the key practices? And we'll be releasing quite soon a set of 14 practices and a diagnostic tool that employers can go to really get that information and do some self-assessment. And then it'll point them to resources to take action. So there is absolutely no one-size-fits-all solution for employers, and I think we've learned it's harder than we thought to support that kind of change management inside companies. But I do think getting clarity about what good looks like can create the opportunity for some of the leaders to step up and make commitments, challenge their peers, and make it easier for small and medium companies to move along as well. think on the public policy front, I mean, I think, you know, the kind of leadership that Mayor Emanuel showed in Chicago in really thinking about the community college system and how to align it tightly to the needs of the labor market is a great example, and we need to see a lot more of that. That's a system that has so much potential to be positive in this space. I think at the federal level, it's time for a real conversation about what is the purpose of education in the country, and how do we make sure we've got an education system that is actually preparing all of our young people to achieve their own potential. I've thought a long time about, you know, how could you think about integrating the Department of Labor and the Department of Education in a way that you have, you know, a real focus on human capital and ensuring everyone has a shot at achieving their potential regardless of their zip code of birth. So that feels like at least a ripe conversation to have in Washington.
So I want to come to what else it takes besides skills in a minute, but before we go to that, I want to talk about the hard thing, which is money. You started to talk about how we finance this. And Denis, particularly to you, states, your principal focus for this project, are the places where when the economy shrank, resources that went into these educational systems also shrank with it. And when the economy recovered, the state level investment in these programs really didn't recover at all. And so what we see today is that these systems are increasingly putting the cost on the worker themselves, on the student. And so when and success rates are low, even the best systems, Governor Emanuel, with very challenged populations, 25% graduation rate, that is really good in these systems. But that's, you know, there's 75% who probably have expenses that they incurred maybe without a degree of economic value. So how do we think about the resources that are going to pay for all this?
Well, I guess I start from the proposition that if last year we authorized basically, let's call it $120 billion for secondary education, overwhelmingly focused on the university student and not at the
federal level.
At the federal level. I start from the proposition that there's not a lack of money. The question is prioritization. So we're focused at the states for a couple of different reasons. One is they're on the hook and they got to deliver. But also there are going to be learnings there that can influence federal level decision making, and I think, you know, hats off to every point that's been made up here, which is how the feds spend the money can be better prioritized. What it can't be is cut and forced the outlays forced onto the states, which is what Washington is doing now, ever since Harry Reid left. And so there is a very significant federal role here, and absent that, it's not fair to the states that they have to pick up these pieces. So I think we need to be more careful about how we invest those resources and not leave it to the states who, as you suggest, operate in a much more stringent fiscal situation a lot of times, where they have, for example, constitutional amendments to balance a budget. And so this oftentimes is the first thing to go.
So I want to get to this other point before we have to close out. It takes a lot more than just what happens in a classroom or in an apprenticeship or other learning experience in order for somebody to be successful at acquiring skills. My colleagues have found these enormous, using online data, we've been able to see the degree to which jobs are here and people live here. And that spatial mismatch creates a huge transportation problem that we heard about in one of the other panels. Stable housing, if your housing is unstable, your ability to do your homework at night, if you don't have internet access. Social services, career counseling. I know, Brent, why don't you start us off? This is something you spent a lot of time thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, not so much on the spatial mismatch, but I think that is a real issue, the declining mobility of the American workforce. You know, the willingness of people to pick up and move to new opportunities is at a low historically, and I don't think we quite understand what the reasons are for that. But that's a challenge. If there are, you know, sort of hot areas of the country in terms of job opportunities, you kind of do need to be willing to go to where those are. If you're living someplace that is either stagnant or in decline, we don't want those communities to wither and die, certainly. but we also need to be realistic about sort of what the opportunities are going to be, so that raises a whole different set of challenges. I think, you know, from the standpoint of the work with ex-offenders and people returning from prison with criminal records, one of the things that has been very challenging that I've learned in the last couple of years is just how ineffective our programs are for assisting people with employment. When I was working on this, we tended to think about employment as being an intervention that was going to prevent recidivism, when in fact it's really an outcome from a successful transition. And that insight really needs to start driving our criminal justice policy, so that individuals with criminal records are getting the support they need, not to get a job, but to make the transition out of prison into the workforce. And what we're finding is there are a few things that really help. We'd like to see the states, you know, pick those issues, those ideas up, and use them. We're putting out a report on this year, actually. But just to address the finance issue for just a second, the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act funding is $10 billion a year. Most of that money is actually going into sustaining a delivery system, right? That doesn't actually deliver much in terms of services. It's not that it's not useful, it is useful, helping us understand the local economy and helping people come in looking for assistance with trying to find a job. But it's a very expensive intake system, essentially, is what we've got on our hands right now. Those systems need to be radically restructured so that those resources are actually going into the kinds of services that will help people get equipped for work, rather than maintaining a delivery system that, like I said, just isn't delivering very much.
Byron?
I think the public policy discussion is very important. I think there's things government can do differently all throughout, and we could talk about that all day. But what I don't want us to miss when we talk about resources and when we talk about systems, how much more important actually the private sector resources and systems are on this topic. You know, we talk about $10 billion for the WIOA and $120 billion for student loans. I agree with that. Businesses spend $450 billion a year, U.S. businesses, on training, right? Their own workforce, and that's to say nothing of sort of payroll. And then their investment decisions matter a lot. And then when they open up a new facility somewhere, the fact that people think it's about low wages and tax breaks as opposed to that it's about sort of business environment, infrastructure, and above all skills, just completely, that damages the political and the policy conversation. But the businesses have right now our systems, the accounting system plus the tax code, you layer those together, and it is a massive pro-automation bias, right? So software and equipment is capital, right? But people and training are expenses. And so you could have the same cash in, same cash out, and if you do it with machines, you're going to have higher stated profits, you're going to have a higher PE, you're going to have higher bonuses, et cetera. And there's a lot. So that wipes out all, in terms of incentive, that wipes out all the federal dollars for training and so forth. So I really think we've got to think about the private sector is the engine of the economy. We have to take it seriously if this is a serious issue. And there's much more that can be done for business to get into the game, and the policy to enable that, I think, matters.
It's a whole other panel, but it's a great set of questions. Elyse?
I mean, I just want to go back to your question about what else needs to be in place, and I think, you know, we do have to look at all those other systems that are holding opportunity youth and other vulnerable populations back. So we talked a little bit about transportation just within a community, things like childcare, mental health, and all of those, you know, are the realities of the day-to-day life of young people and others who, you know, that really hold them back from making successful transitions to work. And I think, you know, those are systems that employers are less likely to be able to tackle. I absolutely would, you know, check on there's an important role, and employers need to be investing deeply in building their talent pipeline and even paying great providers who are delivering great sources of talent, but some of those other systems can really derail young people. And that's where I think government has really got to step up, and we've got to think about how we facilitate a tighter safety net under people so that they don't fall back even when they're putting their best effort forward to skill up, and employers are ready to pull them in.
And are you seeing the best sort of support for those systems coming from local government, state government?
I would say at the state level more. And we see a lot of providers that are stepping up and knitting it together in a very challenging, disorganized market.
Well, I think what this discussion suggests is that there's a tremendous role for the MGM Policy Institute here to be lifting up good practices, to find the models that are working, to try to spread that at not only the local but state government level, and build the case for and public understanding for the federal policy that many of us here have talked about. So we've got great folks working on this. Please join me in thanking the panel for being here.
Good job, guys. Good job, Byron.